So Challengers is the latest film from Luca Guadagnino, and it is super sexual and filled with tennis. It's the best way to say it. Because, like, I think this might be my favorite Guadagnino film just because of how aggressive and just, like, just... I know it's going to sound silly, but, like, it's balls to the wall hard with how it goes about this more or less a love triangle around tennis. Like, especially like the way that the film is, not just how it's shot, but how it darts, but how it becomes like a non-linear narrative. It feels like a tennis match where it's batting around at like different power dynamics and who is in charge and who wants what and who's gonna get what they deserve in the end. And it's just it hooks you immediately from just like the way it's set up and intrigues you from the start. So the film is about the relationship between Patrick and Art, played by Josh O'Connor and Mike Faist, respectively. And they are a tennis duo. Like, they play tennis together, and they're rising up in the ranks. They're doing a great job. But then they see this other tennis player, Tashi, played by Zendaya. And they are transfixed immediately on her. Like, they watch her play, and she is just so into it, and they're like, instantly aroused watching her. So later on, they decide to hook up with her and invite her over to like their hotel room, in which they talk more about tennis, and then, things get a little heated, and they talk about sex, and they talk about masturbation, and it feels like it's leading up to a threesome here. But what makes the film fascinating is that Tashi is not specifically looking for sex. She craves tennis. She loves tennis the same way that Patrick and Art love sex. So she doesn't see Patrick and Art as two guys she wants to have sex with so much as she sees them as two guys that she wants to whip up. She wants to find the right tools to like crank them up and get them to play tennis aggressively, because like that's her thing. Like, and they establish that pretty clearly with just like how she takes the lead in tennis, where it feels like it looks like she's having sex while she's playing tennis, with how aggressive she gets into it. So she's basically playing Art and Patrick to kind of like whip them up and say like, hey, whoever wins this tennis match, they get to win me. Now fight. So she's more or less like, like the humans who were like in the 2014 Godzilla, just like, let them fight. And whoever wins, I'll just taunt them with more sex until they will play more aggressively. And it's fascinating to watch as their careers progress and how they age, and how it all comes down to one final tennis match between Patrick and Art for them to finally realize what they've known all along, which is that Patrick and Art need to be together. Like, everything they set up in the film, like from the way they talk to the way they describe their history, even to the way they eat churros, it's clear these two need to end up to each other and just bang each other, to the point where it feels like Tashi kind of has to like switch gears and force them to go that route. So yeah, if you couldn't tell, this is a highly sexual film, but it works for that. And I think complementing that is the way that Guadagnino shoots the tennis scenes, because he finds every possible dynamic and exciting shot that you could have for a tennis sequence. Like he pans the camera around the tennis the tennis court. He zooms in on Tashi's face in the crowd as the ball's batting back and forth. I'd be fascinated to see how they film this, but like at one point you get the POV of the tennis ball just bouncing off as, these two characters of Patrick and Art, who are just getting angry and aggressive and sweating and having, and drawing from their history of tennis and how they have obvious tells about what they're communicating within their match. It just engages you immediately. Like, there's never a dull moment in this film, whether it's the characters, bickering over sex or power, or having a tennis match, or getting injured, or just, having like the most fascinating of scenes, like especially the places that these characters have sex, like at one point, I think like I think between like Tashi, Patrick, and Art, like Tashi has sex with both of them at the most weirdest points. Like at one point, one of them has sex in a van while it's really windy outside, and at another point they're making out in front of like a closing Applebee's. And just like, and it's like, it feels like it's leaning into like the absurdity of that too, while also just, being pretty arousing with how these characters are framed. And I love how the film has that, without just like, because the thing is like, I think the way that I'm describing this film, people think that there's going to be, a lot of like graphic sex scenes in here, and there really isn't. Like compared to like the other sex scenes that I've seen recently within like like Love Live's Bleeding and Poor Things and stuff like that, there's not a lot of graphic sex, but in terms of sexual tension, it's off the charts. Every scene feels like it's oozing sex, without like the need for being graphic, which I found really fascinating. For Luca Guadagnino's direction, especially with I've mentioned this before in some of my reviews, but I got to mention it here too. It's like some people might think that this film is about a threesome. It's not actually. This film is about a fivesome. It's about Tashi, Patrick, Art, and Atticus Ross and Trent Reznor doing the soundtrack, because the soundtrack. I mean, first off, yeah, it's Ross and Reznor. They always do badass soundtracks. What else is new? But the way that the soundtrack kind of like protrudes into this film, it becomes like another character. Like at one point, Patrick and Art are confronting each other in the sauna, and you can feel like there's sexual tension between them where you're just like, oh god, if they just went a little bit farther, they're gonna kiss each other. And while they keep conversing and getting closer to each other and just showing off like their naked bodies, in comes the Reznor Ross score, and it gets higher and higher and higher in volume to the point where it feels like the soundtrack is gonna have sex with them, which sounds weird, but when you watch the film, it makes sense how this soundtrack kind of like becomes another character that fully engages you with this story that is all about power dynamics and sex and tennis. To the point where it makes it like very obvious at some points. Like at one point, like I think it was with Patrick or Art, they ask Tashi whether or not she's talking about sex or tennis in her euphemisms, and she says, look, I'm always talking about tennis. That's like one of those scenes where it's just like, even when it becomes obvious later on that she's playing them, it's one of those moments where it's almost kind of like, I gave you all the clues, detective. It was all there. I was just all using you for tennis. And on that level, it builds up to like a perfect crescendo by the end of the film. That it is just it's so amazing to watch film with that much like chemistry and energy, and it just feels alive throughout. So yeah, this Challengers is my favorite Luca Guadagnino film.